A powerful CEO laughs in the face of a single dad, mocking his strange hobby as nothing more than childish play. But when danger strikes, that same silly hobby is the only thing standing between her and a terrifying kidnapping. This isn't just about survival, it's about pride, hidden truths, and a shocking family connection no one saw coming. Because when a child whispers a secret that shakes everything she thought she knew, the CEO realizes the man she mocked might hold the key to her future. Now, with her life in danger and her past catching up to her, one question burns. Can the very man she ridiculed become the one who saves not just her life, but her heart? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Margaret Whitfield's heels clicked sharply against the polished marble floors of Carter Industries' executive floor. The sound echoed through the hallway like gunshots, matching her mood after yet another contentious board meeting. She had just finished shutting down concerns about her latest acquisition, a small but promising tech startup she'd managed to snag for pennies on the dollar. "Their poor planning isn't my problem," she muttered to herself, adjusting her perfectly tailored navy blazer. The morning sun streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows caught the silver in her short, expertly styled hair. Her assistant scrambled to keep up, tablet in hand. "Miss Whitfield, Mr. Henderson wanted to discuss the layoffs. Tell him the decision is final." Margaret didn't break stride. "If he's so concerned about those jobs, he can hire them himself." The young woman's face fell, but Margaret didn't notice. She never did. 25 years of fighting her way to the top had taught her that sentiment was a luxury she couldn't afford. Every battle scar, every sacrifice had been worth it to prove wrong all those men who dismissed her as too emotional to lead. The elevator ride to the parking garage was silent, just how she liked it. Her Ferrari waited in its reserved spot, gleaming under the fluorescent lights. But today, she decided to walk home through Warner Park. The spring air would help clear her head before tonight's charity gala. The park was alive with the usual afternoon crowd. Mothers with strollers, joggers, and children racing around the playground. Margaret's designer shoes weren't made for grass, but she'd learned long ago that appearance was everything. She walked with the same confidence she brought to boardroom battles. That's when she noticed the small gathering near the park's center. A man in his early 40s was demonstrating what looked like sword techniques to a handful of onlookers. He wore period costume, some sort of medieval getup, and was showing a young girl how to hold a wooden practice sword. "Did you see?" One woman in expensive yoga wear whispered to her friend. "He does this every week. Some kind of historical recreation thing." Her friend rolled her eyes. How embarrassing. Imagine being his kid. Margaret slowed her pace, watching the scene unfold. The man, tall and lean with kind eyes, was speaking enthusiastically about proper stance and balance. His daughter, probably around 8, beamed up at him with pure adoration. "My daddy knows everything about knights," the little girl announced proudly to anyone who would listen. The yoga women's snickers grew louder. "Guess some people never grow up," one said. Margaret found herself drifting closer to their little circle. Something about the man's earnest dedication to this clearly ridiculous hobby irritated her. It reminded her of all the dreamers she'd encountered in business, the ones who couldn't face reality. "Well," she said, loud enough to carry, "I suppose someone has to keep the Renaissance fair in business." The yoga women turned, recognized her from local business magazines, and laughed appreciatively at her joke. The man faltered slightly in his demonstration, his eyes meeting Margaret's for just a moment. Something flickered there, hurt, resignation, a quiet dignity, before he turned back to his small audience. "And this technique," he continued softly, "was used by knights to protect those who couldn't protect themselves." Margaret felt a slight twinge she refused to acknowledge. Instead, she straightened her spine and continued her walk, the click of her heels on the park's paved path a reminder of her own hard-won success. 10 minutes later, she was sliding into the butter-soft leather seat of her Ferrari. The engine purred to life, a sound that usually filled her with satisfaction. She'd earned this car, earned every luxury she possessed, through decades of ruthless determination. "Pathetic," she murmured, thinking of the man in his costume, playing at being a knight in the middle of a public park. How wonderful it must be, she thought with a touch of bitterness, to live in such a fantasy world. She adjusted her rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of her own carefully maintained image. Success was about power, about control, about never showing weakness. She'd learned that lesson the hard way, and she'd paid dearly for it. The Ferrari pulled smoothly out of its parking spot. Margaret had meetings to prepare for, deals to close, empires to build. She didn't have time to waste thinking about dreaming single fathers and their obsolete hobbies. But as she navigated through the city's afternoon traffic, the man's quiet dignity in the face of mockery kept surfacing in her thoughts. She pushed it aside, just as she'd learned to push aside any emotion that might compromise her carefully constructed walls. The day had been a success, she reminded herself. Another victory in the boardroom, another step toward proving she was untouchable. And if her words had left a mark on some stranger's spirit, well, that was simply the cost of doing business in her world. She turned up the volume on her car's premium sound system, letting classical music drown out any lingering doubts. The Ferrari accelerated smoothly, carrying her toward her penthouse apartment and away from the park, where a father continued teaching his daughter about honor and courage, even as the echoes of laughter faded behind him. The morning sun filtered through worn curtains, casting a warm glow across Daniel Carter's small kitchen. The sounds of sizzling eggs and the gentle hum of the refrigerator filled the cozy space. Daniel stood at the stove in his mechanic's uniform, the name Carter's Auto Repair stitched above his chest pocket. His movements were precise and practiced as he flipped pancakes while simultaneously checking Emily's lunch bag. "Emily, breakfast is almost ready, sweetie," he called up the stairs, his voice carrying the warmth of a father's love. 9-year-old Emily bounded down the stairs, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders. Her dark hair was pulled into slightly uneven pigtails, her own handiwork. "Did you make the special pancakes, Dad? The ones with the smiley faces?" Daniel turned from the stove, revealing a plate with 2 golden-brown pancakes decorated with banana slices for eyes and a curve of strawberries for a mouth. "Would I ever forget?" His eyes crinkled at the corners as he smiled. Emily settled at their small kitchen table, her legs swinging beneath her chair. "Can we practice sword fighting after school today? I almost got that blocking move right yesterday." "We'll see how homework goes first," Daniel replied, setting the plate in front of her. He glanced at the corner of the kitchen, where his practice equipment stood. Wooden swords, shields, and a carefully maintained suit of leather armor. Each piece represented hours of research and dedication to historical accuracy. As Emily ate, Daniel packed away his own lunch and checked his watch. Time for their morning routine. The drive to school was filled with Emily's chatter about her history project, her excitement making Daniel's heart swell. History wasn't just his passion, it was becoming theirs. At the school drop-off line, Daniel noticed a group of parents huddled near the entrance. As he helped Emily out of the car, snippets of their conversation drifted over. "There's that guy who plays dress-up on weekends," one mother whispered, not quite quietly enough. "My husband says he saw him swinging a sword in the park yesterday. Who does that?" The words echoed Margaret Whitfield's cutting remarks from the previous day. Daniel's shoulders tensed, but he forced a smile for Emily's sake. "Have a great day, sweetheart," he said, pulling her into a quick hug. "You too, Dad. Don't forget, blocking practice." Emily skipped away, oblivious to the whispers. Daniel drove to work with the radio off, his mind replaying the morning's comments. The familiar sight of Carter's auto repair shop helped ground him. This was his domain, where greasy engines and honest work spoke louder than judgments. The morning passed in a blur of oil changes and brake repairs until his boss, Mike, stopped by his workstation during lunch break. Daniel was eating his sandwich while reviewing a historical manuscript about medieval combat techniques. "Still playing Knights and Dragons, Carter?" Mike chuckled, gesturing at the book. Daniel closed the book slowly. "It's living history, Mike. Educational demonstrations for kids, mostly." "Whatever you say, Sir Daniel," Mike said with a dismissive wave as he walked away. "Hey, don't let him get to you." Sarah, the front desk manager, called over. She approached Daniel's workbench, wiping her hands on her jeans. My kid was at your demonstration last month. He hasn't stopped talking about how people lived back then. Says he wants to be brave like the knights you taught about." Daniel's tension eased slightly. "Thanks, Sarah. Sometimes I wonder if it's worth all the jokes," Sarah finished. "Look, those kids learn more from watching you than they do from half their textbooks. You're teaching them about honor and standing up for what's right. That's worth a few snickers from people who don't get it." The rest of the workday passed quickly, and soon Daniel was home with Emily, helping her with homework before dinner. The evening routine was comfortable and familiar: dishes, a bit of TV, then bedtime. As he tucked Emily into bed, she grabbed his hand. "Dad, can you tell me the story about the knight who saved the village again?" Daniel sat on the edge of her bed, his work-worn hands gentle as he smoothed her blanket. "Again? You've heard it so many times?" "Please, it's my favorite. The part where everyone laughed at him for practicing so much, but then he was the only one who knew how to fight when the bad guys came." Daniel's voice caught slightly. "Well, sometimes hobbies can make heroes, sweetie, even ones that other people don't understand." The words felt hollow in his throat, echoing with the day's doubts. "Like you, Dad, you're my hero." Emily's eyes were already drooping with sleep. Daniel kissed her forehead, his heart full but heavy. "Good night, my brave knight," he whispered, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching his daughter drift off to sleep, wondering if tomorrow would bring more sideways glances and whispered judgments. The stack of bills on his kitchen table caught his eye as he headed to his own room. Between work, raising Emily alone, and his dedication to historical accuracy in his demonstrations, every day was a balancing act. But looking back at Emily's peaceful face, he knew he wouldn't give up his passion for living history. Even if some people, like that elegant CEO in the park, would never understand why a mechanic spent his free time teaching kids about medieval knights and ancient wisdom. The crystal chandeliers of the Grand Plaza Hotel ballroom cast rainbow reflections across Margaret Whitfield's champagne glass. She stood near a marble column, her designer gown catching the light with each subtle movement. The annual Children's Hospital Charity Gala buzzed with Silicon Valley's elite, CEOs, venture capitalists, and tech moguls, all dressed in their finest. Margaret took another measured sip of champagne, her lipstick leaving a perfect crimson mark on the glass. Her steel-gray hair was swept into an elegant updo, diamond earrings worth more than most cars catching the light. She had donated generously, as always, but tonight something felt off. Across the room, Thomas Reynolds, a former board member she'd ousted last quarter, whispered to a cluster of executives. Their furtive glances in her direction didn't go unnoticed. Margaret lifted her chin slightly, meeting their stares with the same iron will that had earned her the nickname the Glacier in business circles. "Quite the turnout tonight," said a voice beside her. Barbara Chen, head of a rival tech firm, smiled with practiced warmth, though some seemed less than pleased with the company. "The guest list has always been eclectic," Margaret replied smoothly, though her grip tightened on her glass. "How's the hostile takeover of Simple Tech going? I heard their CEO isn't quite ready to retire." Barbara's smile faltered for a moment. "About as well as your attempt to acquire Peterson Industries last spring." Margaret kept her expression neutral, but the jab stung. That failed acquisition had cost her company millions. Around the ballroom, she noticed more hostile glances, more whispered conversations. These were people she'd stepped on during her climb to the top, necessary casualties in the war of corporate success. After 2 hours of carefully navigating social landmines, Margaret decided she'd put in enough appearance time. She made her way to the coat check, collecting her designer wrap. The young attendant's hands trembled slightly as he handed it to her. Apparently, her reputation preceded her even here. The hotel's parking garage was eerily quiet at this hour. Her heels clicked against the concrete, echoing off the walls. Margaret pulled her wrap tighter, suddenly wishing she'd waited for her driver instead of sending him home early. The garage's fluorescent lights flickered, creating strange shadows between the parked cars. She was 20 feet from her Mercedes when she heard it, the scuff of shoes on concrete. Before she could turn, Heavy footsteps rushed toward her from behind. Margaret spun around to see two men in black ski masks emerging from behind a concrete pillar. Her heart lurched. The larger man lunged forward, reaching for her arm. Margaret stumbled backward, her heel catching on the uneven surface. "Stay back," she commanded, trying to summon the same authority that cowed board members. The men said nothing. The smaller one pulled open a van's sliding door. How had she not noticed the dark vehicle parked there? The larger man grabbed for her again, his gloved hands rough against her bare arm. Margaret's carefully constructed world of control shattered. She screamed, a raw, primal sound that echoed through the garage. Her attacker clamped a hand over her mouth, but she bit down hard through the glove. He cursed and pulled back. She tried to run, but her heels betrayed her. The smaller man caught her arm, yanking her toward the van's open door. The smell of leather seats and something chemical filled her nostrils. Margaret thrashed against their grip, her wrap falling to the ground, her perfect updo coming undone. "Help!" she screamed again, her voice bouncing off concrete walls. "Somebody help me!" The larger man grabbed her legs as she kicked out, her shoe flying off and skittering across the garage floor. The smaller one tightened his grip on her arms, trying to force her toward the van's dark interior. For the first time in decades, Margaret felt utterly powerless. Then, from somewhere in the garage, came the sound of running footsteps. "Hey!" a male voice shouted. "Let her go!" The masked men hesitated, their grip loosening slightly. Margaret twisted her head to see a figure sprinting toward them through the dim light. It was Daniel Carter, still in his mechanic's uniform, his face set with determination as he ran toward the scene. The masked men dragged Margaret toward their van, her heels scraping against the asphalt. Her throat burned from screaming, and her designer purse lay scattered across the parking lot, its contents glinting under the streetlights. A shadow moved in the darkness. Daniel Carter emerged from behind a parked car, his movements swift and purposeful. Years of historical combat reenactments had taught him more than just showmanship. They'd built muscle memory and tactical awareness that kicked in without thinking. "Let her go," he commanded, his voice steady but firm. The smaller kidnapper laughed, but Daniel noticed how his grip on Margaret loosened slightly. The larger man reached into his jacket. Daniel didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, using a move practiced countless times in medieval combat demonstrations. His elbow connected with the smaller man's solar plexus, causing him to double over and release Margaret. She stumbled away, gasping. The larger kidnapper pulled out a knife, its blade catching the dim light. Daniel shifted his stance, the same one he used when teaching students how to face armed opponents in his historical defense classes. He kept his breathing steady, just as he'd learned from studying ancient warrior techniques. "You don't want to do this," Daniel said calmly, positioning himself between Margaret and her attackers. The larger man lunged forward with the knife, but Daniel was ready. Using a deflection technique from his Japanese sword training, he redirected the man's momentum, sending him sprawling onto the pavement. The knife clattered away into the darkness. The smaller kidnapper had recovered enough to try grabbing Margaret again, but Daniel spun around. His fist connected with the man's jaw in a clean strike. Not the showy moves from his demonstrations, but the practical techniques he'd learned from studying real combat histories. Both attackers scrambled to their feet, clearly not expecting such skilled resistance. They exchanged glances, then ran toward their van. The engine roared to life, and they sped away into the night, leaving behind only the echo of screeching tires. Margaret stood trembling against a car, her perfect makeup now streaked with tears. "You," she whispered, recognition dawning in her eyes. "You're the man from the park, the one with the—" Her voice trailed off, unable to say silly hobby now. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Daniel gathered Margaret's scattered belongings, handling her expensive purse and wallet with careful respect. "Are you hurt?" he asked softly, handing them back to her. She shook her head, mascara-stained tears still running down her cheeks. "How did you? Where did you learn to?" She couldn't seem to finish her sentences. "Those moves?" Daniel gave a gentle smile. "Years of studying historical combat techniques, real warriors' methods, not just for show. Are you sure you're okay?" Police cars pulled into the parking lot, their red and blue lights painting the scene in alternating colors. 2 officers approached quickly, hands on their weapons until they assessed the situation was now under control. "What happened here?" the first officer asked. Notebook ready. Daniel explained everything clearly and concisely, describing the attackers' appearances and their vehicle with the precise attention to detail he'd learned from reconstructing historical events. He kept his voice low and steady, aware that Margaret was still shaking. A female officer wrapped a shock blanket around Margaret's shoulders while she gave her statement. Margaret's voice quavered as she described the attack, but her eyes kept drifting to Daniel as he spoke with the other officers. When reporters arrived, drawn by police radio chatter about an attempted kidnapping of a prominent CEO, Daniel quietly stepped back. He waved away their questions about his heroic intervention. "Just happened to be in the right place," he said, deflecting their attention back to the police. After the statements were taken and the scene photographed, Margaret approached Daniel. Her usual commanding presence was subdued, her voice soft and uncertain. "Thank you," she said, clutching her recovered purse. I owe you my life." Daniel shook his head. "Anyone would have helped." "No," Margaret insisted, her voice stronger now. "Not anyone could have helped like that. Those skills you have, the ones she swallowed hard, "the ones I laughed at. They saved me tonight." Daniel simply nodded, understanding the weight of her words without needing more. The police offered to escort Margaret home, but she insisted she could drive herself. They watched her climb into her luxury car, her movements still unsteady. Inside her car, Margaret gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. The shock blanket was still draped around her shoulders. She stared through the windshield at nothing in particular, her carefully constructed world thoroughly shaken. "His silly hobby saved me," she whispered to the empty car, her voice catching on the word silly. The same hobby she had mocked just days ago had turned out to be her salvation. Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the weight of humility settle over her shoulders more heavily than the shock blanket. The morning sun cast long shadows across the park as Margaret Whitfield guided her grandson Jacob toward the grassy area where a small crowd had gathered. Her high heels sank slightly into the soft earth, making her wobble, but she maintained her CEO composure. After last night's terror, she felt she owed Daniel Carter a proper thank you, though the thought of admitting she was wrong made her stomach churn. "Look, Grandma, they have swords." Jacob bounced excitedly beside her, pointing at the wooden practice weapons laid out on a blanket. In the center of the gathering, Daniel stood tall in simple period clothing, a loose white shirt and brown vest that somehow made him look both authentic and approachable. His daughter Emily sat cross-legged nearby, watching with obvious pride as her father demonstrated basic sword techniques to a group of entranced children. "Remember," Daniel's gentle voice carried across the lawn, "these skills weren't just for fighting. They taught discipline, respect, and how to protect others." His eyes met Margaret's briefly, and she felt a flicker of shame, remembering her mockery of his hobby. Jacob tugged at her sleeve. "Can I go closer, please?" Margaret nodded, and her grandson darted forward to join the other children. She hung back, watching as Daniel patiently showed the proper stance for holding a wooden sword. His movements were graceful and controlled, nothing like the bumbling historian she'd imagined him to be. Emily noticed Jacob and waved him over to sit beside her. The 2 children quickly fell into animated conversation, heads bent together as Emily explained something about her father's demonstration. Margaret found herself studying the girl's features, noting how her dark hair and bright eyes reminded her of someone, though she couldn't quite place who. After the demonstration, Daniel approached Margaret, while the children played with the wooden swords under careful supervision. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, wiping his brow with a small towel, "I didn't expect to see you here today." "Mr. Carter." Margaret straightened her blazer. "I wanted to properly thank you for last night. What you did was—" She paused, searching for words that wouldn't wound her pride too deeply. "It was impressive, and I owe you an apology for my previous comments about your hobby." Daniel's kind eyes crinkled at the corners. "No apology needed. I'm just glad I could help." Meanwhile, Emily and Jacob had wandered closer, their wooden swords forgotten in the grass. Emily whispered something in Jacob's ear, her small hand cupped conspiratorially around her mouth. Jacob's eyes widened, and before either adult could react, he blurted out, "Emily says, her mommy says I'm her daddy." The words hung in the air like thunder before lightning. Margaret's blood ran cold as she processed what Jacob had said. Daniel's face drained of color, and Emily suddenly looked terrified, realizing her secret wasn't supposed to be shared. "What?" Margaret's voice came out sharp and brittle. "What does that mean?" Daniel held up his hands. "Mrs. Whitfield, I honestly don't know what—" "Emily?" Margaret turned to the little girl, who was now half hiding behind her father. "What did you mean by that?" Emily's lower lip trembled. "I found Mommy's old diary in the attic. She wrote about working at your company, and about Jacob's daddy, and—" "That's enough, sweetheart," Daniel said gently, placing a protective hand on Emily's shoulder. He looked at Margaret with genuine confusion. "My late wife Sarah did work at Whitfield Industries for a few years, but that's all I know. She passed away when Emily was very young." Margaret's mind raced through faces, names, years. Sarah. Who? There had been so many employees, so many people she'd stepped over on her climb to the top. Her carefully constructed world seemed to tilt on its axis. "Jacob, we're leaving." Margaret grabbed her grandson's hand, perhaps a bit too roughly. The boy looked confused and upset. "But Grandma, I want to play with Emily more." "Now, Jacob." Her tone left no room for argument. As she pulled him away, she could hear Daniel calling after her. "Mrs. Whitfield, wait. We should talk about this." But Margaret was already striding across the park, her heels punching holes in the grass. She helped Jacob into her Mercedes, her hands shaking as she buckled his seatbelt. As she drove, Jacob's innocent questions filled the car. "Grandma, why did Emily say that? Is her mommy in heaven? Why did we leave so fast?" Margaret gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles white. The questions she'd successfully avoided for years were now unavoidable, triggered by a child's whispered secret in a sunny park. Her carefully controlled life, built on power, reputation, and ironclad control, suddenly felt as fragile as a house of cards in a storm. She glanced in the rearview mirror at Jacob, who was now quietly looking out the window. His profile, so familiar and yet suddenly strange, made her heart race. How many other secrets lay buried in her company's past, in her family's history? And why did Daniel Carter's late wife believe there was a connection between their families? The sleek car glided through the streets of their upscale neighborhood, but Margaret barely noticed the familiar landmarks. Her mind was too busy unraveling possibilities she'd spent years trying to forget. "Grandma?" Jacob's voice was small and uncertain. "Yes, dear?" She tried to keep her voice steady. "Can we go back to the park tomorrow? Emily is nice, and I like Mr. Carter's sword lessons." Margaret didn't answer. She couldn't. Because tomorrow suddenly seemed like a terrifying unknown, filled with questions she wasn't sure she wanted answered. Margaret's heels clicked against the polished floor of her executive suite as she made her way to her desk early Monday morning. The weekend's events had left her unsettled, and sleep had proved elusive. She pressed the intercom button with a perfectly manicured finger. "Sandra, bring me the HR archives from 8 to 10 years ago," she commanded, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. "Yes, Ms. Whitfield, right away." While waiting, Margaret stared out her floor-to-ceiling windows at the city below. The morning sun caught the glass of neighboring buildings, creating a dazzling display that usually filled her with pride. Today, it just made her head hurt. Sandra wheeled in a cart, loaded with several thick binders. "Here are the employee records you requested, Miss Whitfield. Anything specific you're looking for?" "That will be all." Margaret dismissed her assistant with a wave of her hand. Once alone, she began methodically working through the files. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened the first binder. Names, faces, and employment records blurred together until suddenly there it was. Carter, Rebecca S. Executive Administrative Assistant 2015, 2016. A photograph showed a pretty woman with Emily's eyes and gentle smile. Margaret's throat tightened. She dug deeper, scanning performance reviews and internal memos. Rebecca had worked directly under Thomas Whitfield, Margaret's ex-husband. The discovery made her sink back in her leather chair, a cold feeling spreading through her chest. Across town, Daniel was cleaning up breakfast dishes while Emily packed her school bag. "Daddy," she said, swinging her legs at the kitchen table, "did you know Mommy used to work in a big building downtown?" Daniel paused, soapy plate in hand. "She did, sweetheart. Before you were born." She said the Whitfields were nice people. Emily hugged her stuffed rabbit closer. "She had a picture of them at a company party. You were there too, Daddy." The plate slipped from Daniel's hands, clattering in the sink. "What picture, Emily?" "In Mommy's special box. The one in her dresser drawer." Emily's voice grew quiet. "She showed me before she got sick. She said they were like family once." Daniel dried his hands slowly on a dish towel, his mind racing. Rebecca had never told him much about her time at Whitfield Industries, always changing the subject when it came up. Now he wondered what other secrets she'd taken to her grave. Back in her office, Margaret uncovered more unsettling details. Anonymous complaint forms hinted at inappropriate relationships between upper management and staff. Several bore dates corresponding to Rebecca's employment. Margaret's hands shook as she read between the lines, remembering the whispers that had circulated about Thomas's indiscretions. She pulled up her email and found an old message thread. "Thomas, staff reorganization." The words jumped out at her. "Recent concerns. Maintaining professional standards. Immediate transfer recommended." She'd written that email herself, moving several female employees to different departments. Rebecca Carter had been among them. The morning wore on as Margaret dug through more records. Her coffee grew cold, untouched. A post-it note fell from between 2 pages. Someone's hasty scrawl reading, "TW plus RC spotted again." Margaret crumpled it in her fist. She found herself staring at Rebecca's employee photo again. The woman's kind eyes seemed to look right through her, asking questions Margaret didn't want to answer. Had Thomas? Could Emily possibly be Ms. Whitfield? Sandra's voice came through the intercom. "Your 10 o'clock is waiting." Margaret straightened her blazer and tried to steady her breathing. She gathered the scattered papers, carefully returning them to their folders. The weight of what she'd discovered pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. Years of carefully cultivating her image, of being the powerful woman who'd overcome every obstacle in a male-dominated business world, it could all come crashing down. One whisper of scandal, one hint of impropriety in her company's past, and the board would have the excuse they'd been waiting for. She stood at her window again, watching the city bustle below. The same streets where Daniel had saved her life just days ago. The same streets where, years before, his wife had walked into this building carrying secrets that could now destroy everything Margaret had built. With hands that barely shook, Margaret closed the HR folder and slid it into her desk drawer. "If this gets out, everything I've built could crumble," she whispered to her reflection in the window. Margaret sat in her Mercedes outside Daniel's modest single-story home, her manicured fingers drumming against the steering wheel. The house wasn't what she expected from someone she'd dismissed so easily. Small but well-maintained, with cheerful flower beds and a neat lawn. A child's bicycle leaned against the porch, and wind chimes tinkled softly in the afternoon breeze. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out of her car, smoothing her designer suit. The gravel crunched beneath her expensive heels as she made her way to the front door. Before she could knock, Jacob burst from the back seat of her car where he'd been waiting. "Grandma, wait for me," he called out, racing up beside her. Margaret forced a smile, her hand trembling slightly as she pressed the doorbell. Inside, she heard the patter of small feet and a child's excited voice. The door opened, and Daniel stood there in jeans and a faded t-shirt, his expression open and welcoming despite their history. "Ms. Whitfield," he said, genuine warmth in his voice. "This is a surprise. Please, call me Margaret," she said, trying to mask her discomfort. I wanted to thank you again. Properly this time, and perhaps we could talk about." She glanced meaningfully at the children. Daniel nodded, understanding immediately. "Of course, come in." He stepped aside, gesturing them into his home. "Emily, look who's here." Emily appeared from around the corner, her face lighting up at the sight of Jacob. "Can we play in my room?" she asked, barely waiting for her father's nod, before grabbing Jacob's hand and pulling him down the hallway. Margaret followed Daniel into a small but tidy kitchen. Sunlight streamed through gauzy curtains, warming the worn wooden table and highlighting family photos on the walls. The space smelled of fresh coffee and something sweet. She noticed cookies cooling on a rack by the window. "Tea?" Daniel offered, already reaching for a ceramic teapot decorated with hand-painted flowers. "Emily and I made cookies this morning, if you'd like one." "Tea would be lovely," Margaret replied, perplexed by his ease in the situation. She settled into a kitchen chair, noting how it creaked comfortably, like a familiar friend. As Daniel prepared the tea, Margaret's eyes wandered around the room. Where her own home featured expensive art and designer furniture, his walls displayed Emily's artwork and family photos. A handmade calendar marked with school events and living history days hung next to the refrigerator. Everything spoke of a life lived with purpose and joy, not perfection. Children's laughter echoed from down the hall, making Margaret start slightly. The sound was foreign to her. Her own home rarely heard such genuine mirth. Daniel set a steaming mug before her, the teabag tag hanging over the side. No fine bone china here, just a cheerful ceramic mug with "World's Best Dad" painted on the side. He sat across from her, his own mug warming his hands. "Your home is." Margaret paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound condescending. "It's very warm," Daniel smiled, understanding what she couldn't quite say. "It's not much, but it's filled with love. That's what matters to Emily and me." The honesty in his voice made Margaret's throat tight. She watched as he reached for a cookie, offering her one as well. The simple gesture somehow made her feel both welcome and uncomfortable. From Emily's room came more peals of laughter, followed by Jacob's voice. "This is the best fort ever." "They seem to get along well," Daniel observed, his eyes crinkling with genuine pleasure. Margaret nodded, then forced herself to address the reason for her visit. "About what Emily said at the park." "I wish I had answers for you," Daniel said quietly. "Sarah, my wife. She did work for your company years ago. She spoke of the Whitfields sometimes, but never in detail. I assumed it was just typical office talk." Margaret sipped her tea, surprised to find it perfectly brewed. The timing. It could have complicated implications for everyone involved. A loud thump from Emily's room made them both look up. "We're okay," two voices called out in unison, followed by more giggling. Daniel's smile at the sound was automatic, unguarded. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "Emily hasn't laughed like that in a long time. Not since Sarah passed." The simple observation hit Margaret harder than she expected. When was the last time she'd heard Jacob laugh so freely in her own home? Her massive house, with its perfect furniture and silent rooms, suddenly seemed cold and empty in comparison to this humble kitchen filled with sunlight and cookie crumbs. She watched as Daniel absently straightened a pile of children's books on the counter, his movements natural and practiced. A father's movements. The wall calendar caught her eye again, every square filled with activities and reminders, all centered around making a happy life for his daughter. The children appeared in the doorway, faces flushed with excitement. "Dad, can we show Jacob the backyard? Please?" Emily bounced on her toes, while Jacob looked at his grandmother hopefully. 10 minutes, Margaret found herself saying, surprising everyone including herself. "We need to leave soon." As the screen door slapped shut behind the children, Margaret stood, smoothing her skirt. "I should go," she said, suddenly feeling out of place in this cozy scene of domestic happiness. Daniel walked her to the door, their mugs of tea half finished on the table behind them. Through the window, they could see Emily showing Jacob her climbing tree, their laughter carrying clearly across the yard. Margaret stepped onto the porch, her heels somehow feeling more precarious than usual. The wind chimes tinkled softly, a gentle counterpoint to the children's distant voices. She turned to thank Daniel for the tea, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she found herself staring at the simple porch swing, its cushions worn but inviting, obviously well used. A place where a father and daughter might sit and talk about their day, or read stories, or simply be together. Her own home had no such spaces, No comfortable corners worn smooth by love and use, no kitchen filled with the scent of fresh-baked cookies, no walls decorated with children's artwork, just pristine rooms designed to impress, not to live in. As she walked back to her car, Margaret felt an unfamiliar ache in her chest. She envied Daniel's warm little home, even as her mind raced with the potential scandal that could destroy everything she'd built. The contrast between his contentment and her own carefully constructed world had never been more stark. Margaret Whitfield's corner office commanded a sweeping view of the city skyline, but she barely noticed it today. Her attention was fixed on the plain white envelope that had appeared on her desk sometime during her morning meeting. No return address, no markings, just her name typed in generic font. She picked it up with perfectly steady hands, though her heart quickened. As CEO of a multinational corporation, she received countless letters daily, but something about this one made her pause. Using her gold letter opener, she slit the envelope carefully and withdrew a single sheet of paper. The message was brief, typed in the same generic font. "You think you're untouchable? Next time, no one will save you." Margaret's throat tightened, but she maintained her composure, setting the note down on her polished mahogany desk with deliberate care. The morning sun, streaming through her floor-to-ceiling windows, suddenly felt less warm, less comforting. She pressed the intercom button. "Sandra, come in here, please." Her assistant appeared moments later, tablet in hand. "Yes, Ms. Whitfield? Who delivered this envelope?" Margaret held up the threatening note. Sandra adjusted her glasses. "It came with the regular morning mail delivery, Ms. Whitfield. Is something wrong?" "No, nothing's wrong." Margaret waved her away, the lie coming easily after years of practice. That will be all. Once alone, she allowed herself to sink back in her leather chair. The attempted kidnapping hadn't been random after all. Someone was targeting her specifically. But who? She'd made plenty of enemies during her rise to power. Former business partners she'd outmaneuvered, competitors she'd crushed, employees she'd fired. Throughout the day, Margaret maintained her usual commanding presence. She led a budget meeting, approved a new marketing campaign, and conducted 2 video conferences with international partners. But the note lay in her desk drawer like a ticking bomb. Every time someone entered her office unexpectedly, she flinched internally. When the cleaning staff came through, she watched them with suspicious eyes. Even the familiar click of heels in the hallway made her pause mid-sentence during phone calls. By evening, most employees had gone home. Margaret stood at her window, watching the city lights flicker on one by one. Her reflection showed a woman who appeared completely in control. Perfect makeup, designer suit, not a hair out of place. But beneath that polished exterior, fear had taken root. She pulled out her phone, scrolling to a number she'd saved but never used. Daniel Carter. The man she'd mocked, who'd then saved her life. Her thumb hovered over the call button as pride warred with pragmatism. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, but she pressed call anyway. The phone rang 3 times before his warm, steady voice answered. "Hello? Daniel? This is Margaret Whitfield." She kept her voice professional, distant. "Ms. Whitfield." There was surprise in his tone, but no mockery. "Is everything all right?" Margaret paced her office, heels clicking on the hardwood floor. "I received a threatening note today. It seems the attack wasn't random." A pause. "Are you safe right now?" The genuine concern in his voice made her throat tight. "I'm still at the office. My security team is downstairs. But you're worried enough to call me." Margaret stopped pacing, staring at her reflection in the darkened window. "You have experience with this sort of thing. Through your hobby." The word came out without its usual derision. "Self-defense and situational awareness," Daniel said quietly. "Yes, I do." She closed her eyes, forcing out the words. "I need advice on protecting myself." Another pause, longer this time. She could almost see him thinking, considering his response. "It's not easy asking for help, is it?" "No," Margaret admitted, the word barely audible. "But you're doing it anyway. That takes courage." She wanted to scoff at that, to maintain her usual sharp-edged dignity. Instead, she found herself sinking into one of her visitor chairs, suddenly exhausted. "Will you help me?" "Of course I will." The answer came without hesitation. Then, more softly, "Sometimes faith means trusting people you never thought you would." Margaret sat there in her dimly lit office, phone pressed to her ear, realizing that this man she'd once dismissed as foolish was now someone she was literally trusting with her life. The irony wasn't lost on her, but for once she didn't try to wrap it in sarcasm or deflect it with a cutting remark. "Thank you," she said, simply, meaning it. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees at the city park where Daniel had set up his training area. Margaret stood awkwardly in her designer pantsuit, feeling out of place among the casual weekend crowd. Jacob bounced excitedly beside her, already dressed in the small practice outfit Daniel had brought for him. "Grandmother, look! Mr. Carter brought me special clothes just like his." Jacob tugged at her sleeve, pointing to his matching cargo pants and sturdy boots. Margaret forced a smile. "Yes, dear. Very rustic." She watched as Daniel arranged practice mats on the grass, his movements precise and practiced. Other families were gathering around, parents and children alike, dressed for action. "Welcome, everyone," Daniel called out, his voice carrying across the field with unexpected authority. "Today we're focusing on basic survival skills and self-defense techniques that anyone can learn." Margaret crossed her arms, preparing herself for an afternoon of enduring what she still considered elaborate make-believe. But as Daniel began demonstrating simple escape moves, she found herself paying closer attention. "The most important thing isn't strength," Daniel explained, showing how to break free from a grip. "It's awareness and technique." He caught Margaret's eye. "Would you mind helping me demonstrate?" She hesitated, but Jacob's eager face made refusal impossible. "Oh, very well." She stepped forward, trying to maintain her dignity, as she joined Daniel on the mat. "Now, Mrs. Whitfield, please grab my wrist." Daniel's voice was patient, professional. When she did, he showed how a simple twist and step could break the hold. Your attacker expects you to pull away. Instead, you move toward them, using their own force against them. To her surprise, it worked. Margaret found herself practicing the move several times, each success building her confidence. Jacob watched with wide eyes, clapping when she executed a perfect escape. "That's just like in the movies, grandmother," he exclaimed. Daniel smiled. "Better than movies, Jacob. This is real." He moved on to teach the group about situational awareness, showing them how to spot potential dangers and plan escape routes. Margaret remembered the night of her attempted kidnapping, realizing how Daniel had used these very skills to save her. The afternoon continued with more practical lessons. Daniel taught them how to use everyday objects for protection, how to create distractions, and basic striking techniques. Margaret watched Jacob absorb everything, his usual playfulness replaced by serious concentration. "Mr. Carter," Jacob said during a water break, "you're the coolest grown-up I know. You're like a superhero, but real." Daniel chuckled, ruffling Jacob's hair. "No superhero here, buddy. Just someone who believes in being prepared." Margaret felt something shift inside her as she watched them together. The way Daniel treated Jacob with such natural kindness, the way her grandson looked at him with pure admiration, it stirred emotions she usually kept firmly in check. During the final exercise, they practiced partner drills. Margaret found herself working with Daniel again, this time learning how to block strikes. His hands were gentle but firm as he corrected her form, and she noticed calluses that spoke of years of hard work. "You're a natural," he said as she successfully deflected his slow-motion attack. "Good instincts. Perhaps your hobby isn't quite as foolish as I first thought," Margaret admitted, surprising herself with the confession. Daniel's eyes crinkled with warmth. "High praise indeed, Mrs. Whitfield." As the session wound down, Jacob demonstrated his new skills for Margaret, his face glowing with pride. "Did you see me, grandmother? I can protect you too now." Margaret hugged him close, her throat tight with unexpected emotion. "You certainly can, sweetheart." Over Jacob's head, she met Daniel's gaze. This man, whom she had dismissed so easily, had given her grandson something precious: confidence, capability, and joy. The sun was setting as they packed up the equipment. Other families drifted away, calling out thanks to Daniel. Margaret watched him work, noting how he treated each piece of gear with care and respect. "Thank you," she said quietly when Jacob ran ahead to the car. "This was educational." Daniel nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Sometimes the best defense is knowing you're not helpless. That goes for more than just physical attacks." His words stayed with her as she drove home, Jacob chattering excitedly about everything he'd learned. She glanced at her grandson in the rearview mirror, seeing how he practiced the blocking moves even in his car seat. "Can we go again next week, grandmother? Please?" Margaret found herself nodding. "We'll see, dear." But she already knew they would return. Something had changed today. A wall had begun to crumble. A possibility had opened up that she hadn't allowed herself to consider before. That night, after tucking Jacob into bed with his new practice gloves beside him, Margaret prepared for sleep. As she drifted off, her mind replayed the afternoon's lessons. In her dreams, she was back in that dark parking lot, but this time was different. She stood beside Daniel, their movements synchronized as they faced the shadows together. No longer was she the helpless CEO waiting to be rescued. She was strong, capable, ready to fight her own battles. For the first time since the attack, Margaret slept deeply, her dreams free from fear. Margaret's dining room gleamed under the crystal chandelier, its warm light reflecting off the polished silverware and fine china. She had spent hours ensuring everything was perfect, from the carefully arranged flower centerpiece to the mouth-watering aroma of pot roast wafting from the kitchen. It was the first time in years she'd personally overseen a dinner rather than having it catered. "Emily, would you like more mashed potatoes?" Margaret asked, watching the little girl's face light up. Emily nodded enthusiastically, her dark curls bouncing. "Yes, please." Emily held out her plate. "These are even better than Daddy's. But don't tell him I said that." Daniel chuckled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "My cooking skills have officially been dethroned." He was dressed simply but neatly, in a blue button-down shirt that brought out the warmth in his eyes. Jacob, sitting beside Emily, giggled through a mouthful of carrots. "Grandmother never cooks. This is special." Margaret felt her cheeks flush. "Well, I thought it was time to dust off some old skills." She hadn't admitted to anyone that she'd spent the previous evening practicing the recipes, determined to make this dinner perfect. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter and the clink of cutlery. Emily regaled them with stories from school, while Jacob hung on her every word. Daniel shared amusing tales from his mechanic shop, and Margaret found herself laughing more freely than she had in years. After dinner, they moved to the living room. Margaret's baby grand piano sat in the corner, usually just for show, but tonight felt different. "Do you play?" Daniel asked, nodding toward the piano. Margaret smoothed her silk blouse, suddenly self-conscious. "I used to. It's been years." "Please play something, Grandmother," Jacob pleaded, climbing onto the piano bench and patting the space beside him. Margaret hesitated, then sat down. Her fingers found the keys, and soon the room filled with the gentle notes of Moon River. To her surprise, Daniel began to hum along, his voice rich and pleasant. Emily curled up on the sofa, her eyes heavy with contentment. Jacob leaned against Margaret's shoulder as she played, and for the first time in decades, her home felt truly alive. When the song ended, Daniel stood nearby, his expression soft in the warm lamplight. "That was beautiful, Margaret." She looked up at him, suddenly aware of how close he was standing. Something shifted in the air between them, a spark of connection that made her breath catch. His eyes held hers for a moment too long to be casual, and Margaret felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. "Thank you," she whispered, meaning so much more than just the compliment about her playing. The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibilities. Jacob and Emily were engrossed in a board game they'd discovered, their happy chatter creating a cozy backdrop to this unexpected intimate moment. Then everything changed. The lights went out with a sharp click, plunging the room into darkness. Emily let out a startled yelp. "Stay calm," Daniel said, his voice instantly alert. "Margaret, where's your circuit breaker?" Before she could answer, the sound of breaking glass shattered the peaceful evening. It came from the kitchen, sharp and threatening. "Daddy?" Emily's voice trembled in the darkness. "Come here, sweetheart." Daniel's voice was steady but urgent. "Jacob, you too. Both of you, behind me." Heavy footsteps echoed through the house. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as she fumbled in her pocket for her phone. Before she could dial emergency services, a beam of light cut through the darkness, followed by another. Flashlights. "The CEO's in here?" a gruff voice called from the hallway. Daniel pushed the children behind the piano. "Stay down," he whispered to them. "Don't make a sound." Margaret backed away from the piano, but it was too late. 3 men burst into the room, their faces hidden behind black masks. The beams from their flashlights danced wildly across the walls. "There she is." One of the men lunged forward. Daniel moved with the swift precision Margaret had witnessed before, placing himself between her and the intruders. "Run!" he shouted to her. "Get out now!" But 2 more men appeared from the other doorway. Margaret tried to dash past them, but rough hands grabbed her arms. She kicked and struggled, her perfectly planned dinner evening dissolving into nightmare. "Let her go!" Daniel's voice rang out as he grappled with one of the attackers. Even in the chaos, he maintained position between the intruders and the children's hiding place. Margaret's scream echoed through the house as she was dragged toward the door. She caught a final glimpse of Daniel fighting to reach her while sheltering the children. Then darkness swallowed her vision as something was pulled over her head. The last thing she heard was Emily's terrified cry of, "Daddy!" and Daniel's voice, strong but desperate, calling her name, "Margaret!" Margaret's head throbbed as consciousness slowly returned. The first thing she noticed was the cold, a bone-deep chill that made her shiver. Her wrists burned from rough ropes, binding them behind a metal chair. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, the musty smell of an abandoned warehouse filled her nostrils. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness, each drop echoing through the vast space. Wooden crates and rusted machinery cast long shadows in the weak light filtering through grimy windows high above. Her designer dress was torn and dirty, and her perfectly styled hair hung in disheveled strands around her face. A door creaked open, and footsteps echoed across the concrete floor. Margaret's heart pounded as a figure emerged from the shadows. Her breath caught in her throat as recognition dawned. "Hello, Margaret." The voice was familiar, one she hadn't heard in 5 years. "Surprised to see me?" "Richard Bennett," she whispered, her voice hoarse. The man before her was a ghost from her past. Once an impeccably dressed business partner, now haggard and bitter, his expensive suit replaced by worn clothes. He circled her chair slowly, like a predator toying with its prey. "The mighty Margaret Whitfield. Not so untouchable now, are you? What do you want, Richard?" She tried to keep her voice steady, though fear coursed through her veins. "What do I want?" he laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I want back everything you took from me. My reputation, my future, my life." He slammed his hands down on the arms of her chair, making her flinch. "Remember how you set me up? Made it look like I was embezzling company funds?" Margaret's stomach churned. She remembered all too well. Richard had opposed her aggressive expansion plans, threatening to expose some questionable dealings to the board. She'd manufactured evidence against him, ensuring his disgrace and arrest. The charges were eventually dropped, but his reputation was ruined. "You deserved it," she said, but the words felt hollow even to her. "You were going to destroy everything I built." "Everything you built?" Richard's face contorted with rage. "You built it on lies and betrayal. I lost my wife, my home, my dignity. Do you know what it's like to have your own children ashamed to carry your name?" Each word hit Margaret like a physical blow. She thought of Jacob's innocent face, of Emily's sweet smile. How many families had she torn apart in her relentless pursuit of power? "The great Margaret Whitfield," Richard continued, pacing the floor. "So concerned with her precious legacy. Well, now you'll know what it feels like to lose everything." "The police will find me," Margaret said, but uncertainty crept into her voice. Richard smiled coldly. "Oh, I'm counting on it. But not before the world learns about your dirty secrets. Every underhanded deal, Every person you stepped on to climb to the top. I've spent years gathering evidence. Margaret's mind raced. All her carefully constructed walls were crumbling. She thought of Daniel, his quiet strength, his unwavering moral compass. What would he think when he learned the truth about her past? You know what's ironic? Richard leaned close, his breath hot on her face. I heard you were saved from my first attempt by some nobody, a mechanic with a weird hobby. Is that what it's come to, Margaret? Depending on the kind of person you used to mock? Shame burned in her chest. She had mocked Daniel, just as she'd mocked countless others she deemed beneath her. Now she prayed he would find her, would use those skills she'd once ridiculed to save her life again. I'll leave you to think about your sins, Richard said, straightening up. Don't worry, I'm not going to kill you. Death would be too easy. I want you to live to see everything you built turn to dust. His footsteps echoed as he walked away, and the heavy door slammed shut, leaving Margaret alone in the shadows. The dripping water marked time as tears began to fall down her cheeks. For the first time in decades, Margaret Whitfield felt truly vulnerable. Not just physically, her soul lay bare before her, and she didn't like what she saw. All her achievements, her wealth, her power, what did they matter if they'd been built on the broken lives of others? She thought of Daniel's gentle ways with Emily, how he'd turned mockery into teaching moments for his daughter. She thought of Jacob's laughter at their dinner table, the warmth that had filled her home for the first time in years. Please, God, she whispered into the darkness, her voice trembling. Give me another chance. Let me make things right. The warehouse remained silent except for the steady drip of water and the sound of her quiet sobs. Daniel sat on the edge of his couch, wincing as Emily dabbed at the gash on his forehead with a wet cloth. His ribs ached from where one of the attackers had struck him, but his mind was focused on only one thing. Margaret was out there somewhere, alone and afraid. Daddy, please go to the hospital, Emily pleaded, her small hands trembling as she cleaned his wound. Her eyes were red from crying, and worry creased her young face. You're hurt. I can't, sweetheart. Daniel gently caught her hand and squeezed it. Every minute counts now. Margaret needs help. Jacob sat cross-legged on the floor nearby, unusually quiet. Is my grandma going to be okay? His voice quivered with fear. Daniel leaned forward, ignoring the sharp pain in his side. Look at me, both of you. He waited until both children met his gaze. I promise you, I'm going to bring her back. Sometimes, love gives us strength we didn't know we had. Emily's bottom lip trembled. But what if the bad men hurt you worse? They won't. Daniel stood carefully, moving to the old trunk in the corner of their living room. He opened it, revealing his collection of historical gear, not costume pieces, but carefully researched and functional equipment. Remember all those times you watched me practice? All those demonstrations and training sessions? He pulled out a sturdy leather vest. It wasn't just for show. The phone rang, and Daniel answered quickly. It was Margaret's assistant, Tom. Mr. Carter, we've been going through security footage from the mansion. There's something you should see. I'll be right there. Daniel hung up and turned to his neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, who had come to watch the children. Please keep them safe. I'll call as soon as I can. At Margaret's corporate office, the security room buzzed with nervous energy. Staff members huddled around screens, reviewing footage and making calls. Tom met Daniel at the door, eyeing his injured state with concern. Maybe you should let the police handle this, Tom suggested quietly. Daniel shook his head. They don't know what I know. Show me what you found. Tom pulled up the security video. Watch the lead kidnapper's movements. See how he favors his right leg and that distinctive limp? Jacob, who had insisted on coming along despite protests, suddenly pointed at the screen. That's how Mr. Roberts walks. He came to Grandma's house last month, yelling about money. Daniel turned to Tom. Roberts? James Roberts, Tom explained, pulling up a personnel file. Former business partner. Margaret had to force him out 3 years ago when she discovered he was embezzling funds. He lost everything in the aftermath. Daniel studied the file carefully. Any properties listed under his name? All sold to pay legal fees, Tom replied. But, he hesitated. But what? His family owned an old manufacturing plant on the east side. It's been abandoned for years, but he might still have access. Daniel checked his phone, where he'd installed a tracking app weeks ago, at Margaret's reluctant request. The signal's dead now, but the last ping from Margaret's phone. He zoomed in on the map. It was heading east. The staff exchanged uncertain glances. Daniel understood their hesitation. He was just a mechanic with unusual hobbies, not a trained professional. But he also knew that waiting for official channels might take too long. "I need blueprints of that building," he said firmly. "And I need them now." To his surprise, Jacob tugged at his sleeve. "I know where Grandma keeps her emergency files. She showed me once, said it was our secret." Within minutes, Jacob had led them to a hidden safe in Margaret's office. Tom knew the combination, and inside they found detailed plans of all properties connected to the company, including the old Roberts manufacturing plant. Daniel spread the blueprints across Margaret's desk, his years of tactical study kicking in. He noted entry points, structural weaknesses, potential hiding spots. Each detail he'd learned from his historical reenactments suddenly had vital, real-world significance. "Mr. Carter," Tom said softly, "the police are on their way, but they're caught up with a major incident downtown. It could be hours before they can mount a proper rescue operation." Daniel nodded, his decision already made. He turned to Jacob, kneeling despite the pain in his ribs. "I need you to be brave and go back to Emily now. Can you do that for me?" Jacob threw his arms around Daniel's neck. "Please bring my grandma home." Back at his house, Daniel moved with quiet purpose. He strapped on the leather vest, reinforced with modern armor panels, a fusion of historical protection and contemporary safety he developed for demonstrations. His boots were specially designed for silent movement, inspired by Native American hunting techniques. At his belt, he secured tools that had seen countless reenactments, but never real combat. Emily watched from the doorway as he prepared. "Daddy?" she whispered. Daniel paused, turning to his daughter. Her small face held so much fear, but also trust. He opened his arms, and she ran into them. "I love you, sweetheart," he murmured into her hair. "I'll be back soon. Promise?" "I promise." He kissed her forehead and stood, checking his gear one final time. Mrs. Peterson stepped forward. "The children will be safe with me, Daniel. Just be careful." Daniel nodded, his hand resting on the door handle. The setting sun cast long shadows through the windows, and for a moment he stood very still. All those years of studying historical combat, of practicing movements until they became muscle memory, of enduring jokes and mockery, it had led to this moment. "This isn't a game anymore," he whispered, and stepped out into the gathering dusk. In the dim warehouse, Margaret shifted uncomfortably against the rough ropes binding her wrists. The cold concrete floor had long since numbed her legs, and the musty air filled her lungs with each shallow breath. A single bulb swung gently overhead, casting moving shadows that seemed to mock her predicament. Her perfectly tailored suit was now wrinkled and dirty. Her carefully styled hair had come undone. She barely recognized herself anymore, the polished CEO replaced by someone small and afraid. "How did I end up here?" she whispered to the empty space around her. The echo of her voice bounced off metal walls, sending back a hollow reminder of her solitude. Memories flooded her mind. Board meetings where she'd crushed opposition without mercy. Careers she'd ended with a single memo. The countless times she'd walked past employees without acknowledging their existence. Each recollection stung worse than the ropes cutting into her skin. Then came the memory of that day in the park. Daniel Carter, gentle and patient, teaching children about history. The sound of her own laughter, sharp and cruel, mixing with others as they mocked him. His quiet dignity as he continued his demonstration, never letting the ridicule touch the joy he shared with the kids. "I was so wrong," Margaret admitted to the shadows. "So terribly wrong." She thought of Daniel's home, modest but filled with warmth. The way Emily's eyes lit up when she showed Jacob her room. The sound of children's laughter echoing through halls that weren't cold and empty like her mansion. Even the chipped mugs they'd used for tea had felt more precious than her expensive china. Tears began to roll down her cheeks. "All these years, I thought power meant success. I thought being feared meant being respected. Her voice cracked. I built an empire of empty rooms and hollow victories. For the first time in decades, Margaret Whitfield bowed her head and prayed. God, she whispered, I don't deserve help. I've been proud and cruel. I've hurt people to protect myself. I've pushed away anyone who might have cared. She swallowed hard. But please give me a chance to make things right. The warehouse creaked around her, but something had changed inside her heart. The prayer, clumsy and honest, had awakened something she'd buried long ago: hope. Her captor's footsteps echoed through the building. Margaret straightened her spine as best she could. Robert Chen, her former business partner, emerged from the shadows. His once expensive suit hung loose on his frame, his face gaunt with bitterness. "Comfortable, Margaret?" he sneered, crouching down to her level. "Not quite the executive suite you're used to, is it?" In the past, she would have matched his venom with her own. Instead, she looked directly into his eyes. "You're right, Robert. I hurt you. I was wrong." He blinked, caught off guard by her candor. "What game are you playing?" "No game." Margaret's voice was steady now. "I destroyed your career because I was afraid you'd expose my mistakes. I chose power over decency. I can't undo that damage, but I can admit it was wrong." "A little late for apologies," Robert spat, but uncertainty flickered across his face. "Yes, it is," Margaret agreed. "But that doesn't make them less true." She shifted, sitting up straighter despite her bonds. "You can hurt me, Robert. You can try to destroy everything I've built, but you can't make me the same person who hurt you. I'm not her anymore." Robert paced in front of her, agitated by her calm demeanor. "You think some pretty words change anything? You're still the same cold-hearted witch who ruined me." "No," Margaret said firmly. "I'm someone who finally understands that compassion isn't weakness, that admitting mistakes takes more courage than denying them." She thought of Daniel's quiet strength, his forgiveness of her mockery. "I'm someone who's learning that true power comes from lifting others up, not pushing them down." Robert's hand trembled as he pointed at her. "Shut up! Just shut up!" "I can't change the past, Robert, but I can face it honestly." "Can you?" He storked away into the shadows, leaving Margaret alone again. Her heart pounded, but not from fear anymore. Each word she'd spoken had felt like breaking free from chains she'd carried far longer than these ropes. In the quiet aftermath, Margaret straightened her shoulders. "I'm not done yet," she whispered to herself. The words weren't a challenge or a threat, they were a promise. A promise to become someone worthy of the second chance she'd prayed for, someone worthy of the family she might still have a chance to embrace. The moonlight cast long shadows across the warehouse district as Daniel Carter moved silently between the buildings. His heart pounded, but years of historical reenactments had taught him how to stay focused under pressure. He wore dark clothes and carried a backpack with basic supplies, nothing fancy, just practical gear he'd used in countless demonstrations. Through his binoculars, he spotted 2 guards at the main entrance of the Target warehouse. Their casual stance and frequent cigarette breaks told him they weren't professionals. Daniel remembered Margaret's face when she was dragged away, and his resolve strengthened. "Just like practice," he whispered to himself, though his bruised ribs from the earlier fight ached in protest. He'd done this scenario dozens of times in training. Now, it was real. Moving carefully, Daniel circled to the warehouse's rear entrance. He'd studied the building's layout from old city records, knowing the loading dock would be less guarded. His boots, worn from countless reenactments, made no sound on the gravel. A guard rounded the corner, and Daniel pressed himself against the wall. The man passed within inches, never noticing the shadow that didn't belong. Daniel waited until the footsteps faded before continuing his approach. Inside the warehouse, Margaret tested her bonds again. Hours of working the ropes had left her wrists raw, but she felt the knots loosening. Her captors had underestimated her determination, just like everyone else in her life. Daniel found the service door exactly where the blueprints showed it would be. The lock was simple, nothing compared to the historical mechanisms he'd studied. With steady hands, he worked it open, thankful for all those silly lock-picking demonstrations he'd given to kids. The warehouse interior was a maze of shipping containers and old machinery. Daniel heard voices echoing from somewhere ahead, angry words about revenge and ruined careers. He recognized the main kidnapper's voice from the police description. James Morton, a former business partner Margaret had ousted years ago. Moving from shadow to shadow, Daniel worked his way closer. His mental map of the warehouse guided him through the darkness. 2 more guards passed by, complaining about the late shift. Daniel waited patiently, remembering the countless times he'd taught children about the importance of timing in historical battles. Finally, he spotted Margaret. She sat tied to a chair in a pool of light, her usual perfect appearance disheveled, but her eyes alert and defiant. Morton paced before her, waving his arms as he ranted about his grievances. 2 guards stood nearby, looking bored. Daniel reached into his pack and pulled out a small smoke capsule, another prop from his demonstrations that would now serve a real purpose. He rolled it toward the far corner of the warehouse, where it began releasing a thick cloud. "Fire!" one guard shouted, running toward the smoke. The other followed, leaving Morton alone with Margaret. Daniel moved quickly now, closing the distance. Morton turned at the sound of approaching footsteps, but too late. Daniel's first strike, practiced thousands of times in demonstrations, caught Morton perfectly in the jaw. The man stumbled backward, shocked by the sudden attack. "You?" Morton spat blood, recognizing Daniel from news reports of the first kidnapping attempt. "The hobby guy?" Daniel said nothing, positioning himself between Morton and Margaret. He could hear her working at her bonds behind him. Morton pulled a gun, but Daniel was already moving. Years of choreographed fight scenes had taught him to read body language. He knocked the weapon aside as Morton fired, the bullet sparking off machinery. They grappled, Morton's rage meeting Daniel's practiced technique. "Almost got it," Margaret called out, her voice strained as she worked on the last knot. The guards, realizing they'd been tricked, came running back. Daniel fought defensively, using Morton as a shield while looking for an advantage. His ribs screamed in protest, but he refused to give in. Margaret finally freed herself and grabbed Morton's dropped gun. "Back off!" she commanded, her CEO voice carrying natural authority. The guards hesitated, giving Daniel the opening he needed. 2 swift strikes, just like he'd demonstrated countless times, and Morton crumpled to the ground. The guards raised their hands, suddenly less confident without their boss. Margaret kept the gun trained on them while Daniel quickly tied them up, using the same ropes that had held her. They worked together smoothly, as if they'd rehearsed it. "Those knots won't come loose," Daniel said, testing the bindings. "I learned that one from a colonial sailor's manual." Margaret actually laughed, though it held a hint of hysteria. "Your hobby really does come in handy." Distant sirens grew louder. Help was coming. Daniel's anonymous tip to the police had worked. He gathered Margaret into his arms, feeling her trembling despite her brave face. "You're safe now," he whispered, holding her close. "It's over." She clutched his shirt, finally allowing herself to feel the fear she'd been fighting. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." The warehouse filled with flashing red and blue lights as police cars surrounded the building. Daniel kept his arms around Margaret, supporting her as she steadied herself. Together, they waited for the officers to arrive, both understanding that something fundamental had changed between them. The sirens wailed outside, but inside the warehouse, in that moment before chaos erupted again, they simply held onto each other. The CEO and the hobbyist, survivors together. The late afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of Margaret Whitfield's mansion, casting a warm glow across the elegant living room. Instead of the usual stiff corporate decorations, cheerful flowers and bright balloons adorned the space. The formal furniture had been rearranged into cozy conversation areas, making the typically imposing room feel welcoming and intimate. Margaret stood before her floor-length mirror, smoothing down her simple blue dress, so different from her usual power suits. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her pearl necklace. The face that looked back at her seemed softer somehow, the hard lines of ambition replaced by something gentler. "Grandma! They're here!" Jacob's excited voice echoed through the hallway. Margaret smiled at his enthusiasm, so different from the quiet, reserved child he'd been just weeks ago. The doorbell chimed, and Margaret heard her housekeeper welcoming the first guests. Taking a deep breath, She headed downstairs, where Daniel and Emily were just stepping into the foyer. Emily wore a pretty yellow dress, her dark curls tied back with matching ribbons. Daniel had traded his work clothes for a clean button-down shirt and khakis, though he still looked slightly uncomfortable in the grand setting. "Welcome," Margaret said warmly, meaning it with all her heart. The words felt different now, not the practiced greeting of a CEO, but the genuine welcome of a friend, maybe even family. Emily rushed forward to hug Margaret's legs. "Your house looks so pretty with the balloons," she exclaimed. "Thank you, sweetheart." Margaret bent down to return the girl's hug, no longer worried about wrinkling her clothes or maintaining her image. "Jacob's in the garden, if you'd like to join him." As Emily scampered off, Daniel stepped forward. "You didn't have to do all this," he said quietly. Margaret shook her head. "Yes, I did. More than you know." Over the next hour, the house filled with carefully chosen guests, not the usual crowd of business associates and social climbers, but people who mattered. Her closest friends, a few trusted colleagues, and even some of Daniel's friends from his reenactment group, their slight awkwardness in the fancy setting overshadowed by their genuine warmth. The children played tag in the garden, their laughter drifting through the open French doors. Margaret watched them from her spot near the fireplace, marveling at how Emily and Jacob had become inseparable. Their friendship had helped heal wounds she hadn't even known existed. When the catered dinner was cleared away and everyone had settled in with coffee and dessert, Margaret stood, gently tapping her glass for attention. The familiar gesture felt different now, less like commanding attention and more like requesting it. "Thank you all for coming tonight," she began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Some of you might be wondering why I've gathered you here. It's not for a business announcement or a charity fundraiser." She paused, looking around the room until her eyes met Daniel's. "It's about something much more important: family, truth, and second chances." The room grew quiet, even the children stopping their play to listen. 2 weeks ago, I was abducted by someone who wanted revenge for my past business decisions. But that's not the real story. The real story began weeks before that, in a park, where I stood with other women and mockingly laughed at a man who spent his weekends doing historical reenactments. Daniel shifted in his seat, but his eyes remained kind, encouraging her to continue. "That man was Daniel Carter, and his silly hobby ended up saving my life. Twice." Margaret's voice cracked slightly. "The skills he learned through those reenactments, the discipline, the tactical thinking, everything I once dismissed as childish became my salvation." She turned to face Daniel directly. "I owe you my life, but I owe you something even more precious. You showed me that true strength isn't about power or control. It's about compassion, humility, and the courage to open your heart." Margaret took another deep breath before continuing. "Which is why I've made some decisions. Starting next month, I'm stepping back from my role as CEO. I'll remain on the board, but my focus will be on family and using my resources to help others." A murmur of surprise rippled through the room. Margaret smiled, understanding their shock. The Margaret Whitfield they knew would never willingly give up control. "I've established a new charitable foundation that will focus on supporting single parents and their children, as well as programs that teach valuable life skills through historical education and reenactment activities." She glanced at Daniel, seeing his eyes widen in surprise. "Sometimes the most important lessons come from unexpected places. Sometimes the people we dismiss most quickly become our greatest teachers. And sometimes—" She looked at Emily and Jacob, now sitting together on the window seat. "Sometimes children speak truths that adults are too afraid to face." Margaret raised her glass. "To new beginnings, to second chances, and to the power of love to change everything." The room erupted in applause, but Margaret barely heard it. She was watching Daniel's face, seeing the emotion there, the pride and something else, something that made her heart beat faster. As conversations resumed around them, Daniel made his way to her side. "That was quite a speech," he said softly. "It was the truth," Margaret replied, "something I haven't always been good at telling." Emily and Jacob ran up then, faces flushed with excitement. "Can we have more cake?" Jacob asked, while Emily added, "Please?" Margaret laughed, a free and joyous sound that would have been unthinkable in this room just months ago. She looked around at the gathered faces: Daniel's quiet strength, Emily's innocent wisdom, Jacob's open heart, and friends, both old and new. This was what mattered. Not the power she'd spent decades accumulating, not the fierce independence she'd worn like armor, but this: love, family, and the courage to embrace both. Her heart felt full, finally at peace. The woman who had once stood in a park, coldly mocking a single father's passion, was gone. In her place stood someone new, someone who understood that true legacy wasn't measured in corporate achievements or social status, but in the lives we touch and the love we share. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below, and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you enjoyed the story of Margaret Whitfield, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.